Story 1. I worked as a front office manager for a gastroenterologist for a while. Every morning the fax machine was filled with colonoscopy pictures. They were not pleasant. Then the patients would call and come in, and it was 8 hours a day of listening to stories about bowel movements, textures, frequencies, and findings. I really prefer my non-sphincter-related little office job now. Story 2. I was a cashew flicker at a candy factory. I removed the bad cashews from a conveyor belt. Story 3. I was a furnace helper in a steel factory. We made bumper mounts and hinges for truck hoods and other heavy steel parts. I unloaded red-hot parts from the furnace with a pair of tongs. I used to catch fire 2 or 3 times a day. I hated that. Story 4. I worked at a high-kill animal shelter about 10 years ago, and it was soul-crushing. Putting perfectly healthy and friendly animals to sleep on a daily basis was more than I could stand after a year. Most of my co-workers were unpleasant people. Story 5. I was an in-home caretaker for adults with mental illness. Learning how some of them ended up in the care home broke my heart. Many had been abused repeatedly since childhood. Life could have been so different for them if someone had stepped in sooner, if their abusers had not harmed them. But the worst part was the other employees. They did not care about the patients and lazily babysat them with no concern for their happiness or well-being. The patients had no one, no visitors, no family, and no joy. One day, I cried going to work and realized I could not continue. Story 6. I was a soccer referee between 14 and 18 years old and refereed ages 8 all the way up to high school level. Tournaments were awful. Just a full day of running back and forth while people yell at you and dislike you because their child's team is losing. Worst job ever. Story 7. Cattle loader at a slaughterhouse. Not a fun job at all. Story 8. Pauly Shore's personal assistant. The wheeze is not calm. Story 9. Laugh Out Loud Spirit Halloween Store. That place was ridiculous. Story 10. Cashier at Albertsons. They would use the intercom to call you back to the register if you went to the bathroom, put up lists of the lowest performers in the break room, called us into the office once a week to ask why we made price adjustments for items that rang up at the wrong price, inquiring about each individual change. They reprimanded staff for not wearing uniforms the store never ordered and held paychecks if you called in sick until they could embarrass you in front of the entire store. I hated that job. Story 11. Marketing department at a car dealership had low wages, sexual harassment, regular harassment, and incompetent management. The company would not even pay for the basic tools required to do my job. Additionally, the building was riddled with mold, causing everyone to be sick all the time. Story 12. I worked for a Christian wealth management company. That feels ironic based on what the Bible teaches. The people, both staff and clients, were some of the slimiest, most entitled, and rude individuals I have ever encountered. The owner of the company used to almost run down the hallways, and if you could not keep up with him by running or walking, you would not get his attention. That behavior was very telling about the culture. It taught me a lot about how not to manage people in business. Ultimately, I am glad I learned something. Comparatively, many of you have had some absolutely horrendous jobs, and I acknowledge my privileged social position in this answer. I am sorry for what some of you have had to do to pay the bills. Story 13. Epic engineering. Worst job ever. The head of human resources was having an affair with the chief executive officer and was insanely jealous of anyone the chief executive officer even asked to run an errand for. Desperate women can ruin anything. Forget you, Nicole. Newsflash, Mrs. Garcia, your boyfriend has a wife. Story 14. Campus safety as a student. I would have a full day of classes and fall asleep around 11 p.m. to midnight if my other job did not get in the way. I would wake up at 2:30 a.m. to 3:30 a.m., depending on what shift I was doing. In the dead of night, I would walk over to the headquarters on campus. We would get a card, a radio, and a special pin to unlock specific doors on campus. Then we would walk around for 5 hours and scan our card on doors. That was it. Walk to the door, scan. If it did not open, move on. If it did, try to close it. If it did not close, we had an issue. When we finished with a specific area, we reported it via radio and gave our locations when asked. The issue with this job was that it took a heavy toll on me as a student. I remember walking for hours, wishing I could sleep. I was only getting paid minimum wage for this, and it was a lot of work for someone who was tired and stressed out already. Another issue was that we already had professional security guards patrolling our campus and doing the exact same thing as we were, just with better pay. We would cross paths and check doors right after they already checked them. There was not really a point to what we were doing, and it was daunting to wake up at that time and consider whether it was worth minimum wage to do what I was doing. It absolutely affected my schoolwork and my already questionable mental state. By the time I got back to my dorm, I was too tired to shower, and if I could not fall asleep, I would stay awake until I had to go to the hospital on campus, health science major, for my 3-hour lectures. I got a much better job on campus, and from that point on, I have been of the opinion of minimum wage, minimum work. People should get paid for their time, energy, and effort. If the work is not minimal, then why should I get paid like it is? It also taught me that I should not feel like I want to blow my head off when going to work. It made me reconsider my major and my future. Now I am doing one that deeply fascinates me and keeps me engaged. I do not want to spend the rest of my life working a job I do not want to do. Story 15. Working in the insurance industry is challenging. Also, shout out to my boss in the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning industry who traumatized me beyond repair. Story 16. My first job was at Wendy's. They made me clean the dishes every day, which I hated. They kept giving me the closing shifts. Working in a fast food place until 2 a.m. was not fun. Story 17. Working at my grandfather's game store. I often encountered typical situations because I am a girl, such as people asking if there was someone more qualified to help or customers flirting with me. Additionally, some people thought it was acceptable to invade my personal space and yell at me. The reason I decided to quit and never return was when a rather heavy-set man who refused to shower asked for my phone number. When I declined, he began throwing items at me. Other customers asked him to stop, but he responded by vaulting over the counter, like a move seen in movies and anime. However, he was so heavy that he crashed through the glass and into the Dungeons and Dragons collections. Story 18. It was carrying more than 50-pound bags of cement from the back of a warehouse onto the back of a semi-truck. That was basically all we did, going back and forth day in and day out with little to no breaks. It did not matter if it was hot or cold outside because the work was very hard. Story 19. Line cook at the only restaurant on a Navy base. Absolute nightmare. Story 20. Texas Roadhouse server. Your section is very busy, but all the servers need to stop and dance like a bunch of clowns to some country rodeo music. Being an introvert, that job was the worst. Took me less than a month to get fired. Story 21. Caveat. This was the worst job I had, as the conditions were dangerous and involved heavy manual labor, but it was also the best-paying job. I worked for one summer in a lead refinery as part of a student program. The building was 100 years old. There was so much lead dust in the air. We had to wear full coveralls, helmet, breathing mask, earmuffs, and shower after work. We also had to get blood tests every month to check blood lead levels. Mostly, the job was fairly easy and mundane. Wait for the crane, attach the lead sheets to the crane, wait for the crane, and repeat. You did have to keep your head up around the boiling vats of molten lead. One day, I was given the task of cleaning up the lead that had fallen over the edge of the vats and into the basement. I went down to the boiling hot basement under the vats, shoveled lead into buckets, carried them up the stairs, and dumped the lead back into the vats. I did this all day. It was hell. Story 22. I am now retired. I started working at 12 and a half years old, delivering newspapers. Anyone who thinks being a paperboy was not hard work can disagree with me. I have had only 5 jobs in my life, including serving in the Navy. The paper route was the worst job, hands down. Story 23. I worked for a printer ink company. We had to do cold calling, which I did not hate as much as selling those inks. This is when I realized I really was not made for sales. I would say, "Do you need ink? No? Cool, bye." Story 24. My first job was at a movie theater. I was one of the few staff members above the age of 16, so I was always assigned to clean bathrooms, deal with clogs, and clean up vomit. Felt like a punishment. The managers tended to make you clean bathrooms more often if you tried to call out, even with a valid reason. Once I had to call out for 3 days straight with a doctor's note because I had a severe flu. They still wanted me to call in each day to check if I felt better. I was a very anxious teenager, so when they asked if I felt better even slightly, I was forced to come in, even though I was still very sick by all measures. This was before the COVID-19 pandemic, so they did not really care. An elderly person had an accident in the bathroom and was embarrassed, so they stomped tissue paper and toilet covers on it to cover it up. It dried and hardened onto the floor, and they made me scrub it off on my hands and knees while I was still very ill. I was too afraid of getting yelled at or in trouble, so I waited a whole week to submit my 2 weeks' notice. When they asked me to stay at least until the next big movie, which was another 2 weeks away, I complied. People were also very difficult at the movie theater. There was a policy where if customers were loud and angry enough, they would get something for free. So, we spent the whole day being screamed at by people twice our age, rushing between theaters to clean huge messes, and then returning to concessions to face long lines full of people who just wanted to yell at us. Story 25. I think bad bosses are what make bad jobs. I had a boss once whose motivational style was to say things like, "If you mess this up, I am going to kill you." His close team members, who liked him because he protected them, called themselves Satan's little helpers, with him being Satan. I was ostracized because I would not go to strip clubs with them during lunch. I do not respect Warren. Story 26. When I was younger, I took a web design job for a women-centered erotica production because I wanted to support that as a feminist. I then met the rest of the crew, including other semi-famous groups at industry meetings. All of the managers in my company were men with female models or hires. While I was there, I saw screaming at female staff for being injured and refusing to let someone get stitches after a freak accident, where a heavy fire extinguisher dropped off a wall and cut someone's arm. I also saw screaming at actresses for not wanting to do acts they deemed dangerous and really bizarre behavior. I encountered the worst sorts of men, often men pretending to be women to trick other men into thinking they were consuming ethical erotica. These men went out of their way to make good choices about their sexuality but were lied to because they would pay more for ethical erotica. One of the most striking things was hearing these men say what women liked. They were almost never right. They claimed all women were bisexual and that no woman would ever want to watch, for example, 2 men. They talked with disgust about gay men and mocked things that lesbians actually do. It was just depressing all around. I have had more dangerous and physically dirty jobs, but this job felt like it contaminated the soul. It was the only job I ever quit where I told the boss he had a personality disorder. Story 27. In 1970, working part-time in high school for $1.25 per hour at a vegetable wholesaler, my typical tasks included handling train cars full of 100-pound burlap sacks of potatoes. I unloaded, dumped, graded, and sorted them into 5- and 10-pound bags for retail. I only weighed about 128 pounds and had to bear hug the bags to move them. The burlap quickly wore away much of the skin on my arms. I was wiry and had a stronger back then, but it was still very difficult work. Story 28. Working the 3rd shift at Walmart while going to college full-time was a mistake. I don't know what I was thinking trying to do both. Once, an upper manager told me how he did that all 4 years of college while playing football. 24 years later, Ross, I'm glad you could do it. Not all of us can. So kiss my grits. That's not the worst part. After I quit Walmart, I had a very hard time finding work. No joke, no lie. Finding a job was like finding a gold nugget. I wish I had found security work back then. Story 29. Worked for a major supplier for Boeing. Every coworker there was focused on gatekeeping and flattering bosses. I believe the worst jobs can be great with great coworkers and bosses, and the best jobs can be terrible with horrible bosses and coworkers. Story 30. I sold cars for years and made great money. However, I started to notice that the most aggravating customers were the ones with the most money who got the best deals. Meanwhile, the grateful customers who were pleasant until the end spent more than they had to. I could not take it anymore. Story 31. I worked in a slaughterhouse for 10 years and once had to collect cow feces samples directly from the gut of dead cows for weeks to analyze their diet. If I did it first thing in the morning, I swear I could smell it all day, even after changing clothes. It was an unpleasant job, pun intended. Story 32. I have been to basic training. I have been to actual war in rear support. I have shoveled out a sewer transfer station. The worst job I have ever had is working at Walmart. Story 33. I collected semen from chickens for artificial insemination. You have to stimulate them manually, which is not my job. When you enter the room, the chickens immediately begin to ejaculate. We had to rush and get the collection vial in place quickly, or the day's worth of semen would be lost. There was so much semen on my gloves. Story 34. Collecting drug debts is very dangerous. More than that, it creates a sad environment and weighs heavily on your soul. Story 35. I have worked various retail jobs, and I have been lucky that none of them were too horrible. The worst was Staples. I worked in the print center, where 50% of customers needed their print jobs immediately and were not willing to pay the rush fee. Despite my 20Q jobs, 40% were people too old or unable to operate the self-serve printers, and the other 10% would yell at me when I refused to print copyrighted materials for them. The pay was about $13 an hour in 2022. Story 36. Selling hot dogs at a gay beach in Chicago. The irony almost killed me. Story 37. It was actually my dream job, and it still is today, even though I know it won't happen. Unfortunately, my boss, the owner of this small business, combined Christianity and mental illness in a way that had nothing to do with Jesus, logic, or being a decent person. When he wanted to advertise to local Christian groups, I helped him. When he wanted to create a website banner that incorporated subtle religious themes, I helped him. Then he started bringing his religious views into the meetings. In the beginning, I could say, I think we should do X and Y because of Z. His response would be asking questions like, what do we need to do to make X happen? And how will we apply Z to this specific business? Eventually, his responses became things like, I'm going to pray on this decision because scientists have just proved that Noah's Ark exists, and that means evolution is wrong. Natural selection does not exist. Am I right? Oh, you think Charles Darwin was right? Then why did he get exposed for making a fake human link fossil skull? Oh, you think I'm getting him confused with Charles Dawson? They were the same person. He obviously tried to work under a fake name. Things got worse to the point where I was actively sabotaging the business. Story 38. Psychiatric and Forensic Intensive Care Unit Nurse. There was a lot of violence and threats, especially with the mandates to avoid restraining patients. I had my arm broken. A coworker had their head injured. A doctor was stabbed. Many patients were revolving doors. Released, committed a crime, brought back to the hospital, treated, released, and returned again. Story 39. I worked at a Walmart distribution center in the South. They literally set you up to fail and then blame you for it. They expect you to process 3,500 items per day. If you don't meet this expectation, you get penalized. But it gets worse. You have zero control over the freight they bring to you. If you're good friends with the forklift drivers, they'll bring you pallets loaded with light, small items. Some of those pallets have 300 to 500 items on them that don't even weigh a pound. If they are neutral towards you or don't like you, you'll get heavy items, and pallets with heavy items typically only have 5 to 20 items on them. So you are going to have a hard day physically and not make your numbers. They'll blame you for it, even though all the managers will admit that there is no way for anyone to make their numbers with the setup as it is. Mind you, this was years ago, so I don't know if it's still this bad. But I'll never forget. As long as I live, this forklift driver made friends with a guy who worked next to me. One day I had 0 pallets and had finished all my work. He still had 4 pallets needing to be processed. So I thought, thank God. She's coming with a pallet of about 500 tiny items. This is going to make my day so much easier. She drove right past me and gave it to him. It was the dumbest system ever. Just make friends with the forklift drivers or your life sucks. Story 40. I took this job because I needed the money, but it turned out to be the worst decision ever. My task was cleaning portable toilets after massive festivals. It was beyond disgusting. On the first day, they gave me gloves, a mask, and a vacuum hose. I opened the first portable toilet and it was like a horror movie. The floor was covered in unknown substances, and the walls showed no respect from people. I started the hose, but it immediately clogged. Then it backfired, spraying waste all over me, boots, gloves, pants, everywhere. The smell was brutal. I was gagging, questioning every life choice. By the end of the day, I was drenched in sweat and covered in filth. I got home, took the longest shower ever, and knew there was no way I was going back. Hands down, the worst job I have ever had. Story 41. When I was incarcerated, I was assigned to the facility's wastewater treatment plant for 12 cents per hour. Much of my job involved removing condoms and drug paraphernalia from the screen and turning waste with shovels to help it dry faster. No vaccinations were provided, and personal protective equipment consisted of rubber boots, gloves, and cotton coveralls, which we had to remove, squat, and cough when re-entering the facility. Story 42. Telemarketer. I only did it for 3 days. The office supervisor was a woman named Melissa who told me I sounded too much like a robot and actually said, "We need to put you on some medication." I was already taking it for anxiety, and she yelled at me, "Take more." They barely trained me as well. Story 43. Daycare. I have worked for 3 and had to report each one for neglect or abuse. Story 44. Domino's was the worst. I was a general manager making close to $75,000 a year. Pay was amazing. The perks I got from the bosses were really awesome. The job sucked. I was working a minimum of 50 hours a week. Most of the time it was 60-hour weeks. The worst week was 68 hours. I was salaried. They didn't pay anyone else well, so all I ever got for inside help were teenagers or college kids who wanted a job. Usually, I didn't have opening or closing help. Most of the time, I'd be working open to close shifts, 15-hour shifts. There were large orders or just so much to do, such as prep, truck deliveries, paperwork, scheduling, maintaining miscellaneous things, and prep, usually by myself. Not to mention, the store owners were ignorant and cocky. They were downright rude and literally told me they didn't care about anyone who worked for them unless that person made them money. After I had my son, the 60-hour workweeks became too much, as well as everything else. Ultimately, I was terminated for starting an argument with the main boss. Now, I am in a much better spot in life. Domino's was like having a relationship with an abusive partner. Story 45. Cashier. No, I respect people who work in supermarkets. Story 46. Part-time mail carrier. It was one of my first jobs. I liked the freedom it gave, but that was all. You have to walk the same route every day while carrying the weight of letters and magazines. It is very repetitive and you only meet people briefly. The pay is low. There is a lot of pressure to perform, and my boss was very difficult. You also become sore, and the work takes a long time. I hated every aspect of it. Story 47. I babysat for 1 month last year. I worked for a woman who lived a couple of blocks from my home. I worked from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m., 5 days a week, taking care of her 7-year-old child, including breakfast, lunch, dinner, and cleaning. She only paid me once after my first week and gave me just $75. Story 48. To pay for school, I made paint in the summers. I had to dump multiple skids of 50-pound bags of pigment into a huge mixing vat, red oxide or titanium white. It was hot and very tiring. It was unpleasant. Although I had a six-pack by the time school started, I was blowing white and red pigment out of my nose until Christmas. It was the late 1980s and they had respirators. The pigment was so fine it got everywhere, even with protection. Story 49. Electrician for Union Pacific. You are expendable and anything that happens is your fault. Forget your family. Forget your ability to function. Forget your overtime because training does not qualify for overtime even if you worked 16 hours out of 24. The worst part is the pay in Roseville, California is the same as an electrician in a remote station in Arkansas. A 110-person shop gets 1 overall vote and a 3-person shop also gets 1 overall vote. Story 50. The Army. Rather than explaining why it was the worst in any detail, it might be more illustrative to note that the best thing the army did for me was show me just how dysfunctional an organization could be and still get a job done. I have done some unwise things in the corporate world, but never once have I been pulled from my actual job to help people pretend to do the same job and convinced my supervisors that instead of doing any of that, we should pretend to do yet another job. Story 51. I spent 6 months working the front desk overnight at a Motel 6. It destroyed my faith in humanity. Story 52. Boy Scouts of America's summer camp staff. Duration: 6 to 9 months. When I say summer camp, I'm not talking about dropping Timmy off for a day adventure and picking him up later. You drop Timmy off in May, and when you see him in August, he has a full beard, a log cabin, a wife named Charlotte, and he's probably killed something. It was one of the best summers, filled with the most privileged, crazy, warm-hearted, Walmart shenanigans, redneck, wild fun. Plus, there was a lake. Story 53. When I was 18, I was a personal assistant to a South African restaurant owner who also had a business designing dog clothes made from other animals' leather. He was very enthusiastic. Story 54. My sister's best friend and her family had an ongoing contract to run the yearly Easter Bunny and Santa Land photo setups in the only mall in my city. I started working there when I was around 16. Paid well, had flexible hours, and was seasonal right before the holidays. I was able to work for a month, make some extra cash, and then it ended. At Christmas, I usually took photos as the elf but occasionally ran the register. At Easter, I started taking photos but eventually became the Easter Bunny. Yes, I was the one in the suit, because it paid more and I thought, all you have to do is sit there all day. How bad could that be? Friends, please believe me when I say both jobs were bad. I'll start with Easter since it was shorter. The bunny suit was unbearably hot. The Easter land setup was right under the glass roof enclosure at our mall. So I was sitting under a heat lamp in a giant costume that smelled awful. It was shared with another Easter bunny and probably never washed properly. I had to deal with people shoving screaming, crying babies and toddlers at me. It didn't matter if a child was terrified or had an accident in their diaper. The parents just tossed them on me to get their photo taken. Despite knowing how awful my shifts were, I went in once while hungover and almost passed out from the heat, nausea, and dehydration. Nothing, however, compares to Santa Land. That's where I learned the holidays cause people to behave in unexpected ways. We had a 3-photo limit because the line was always insanely long, and also because if your child was crying, more photos wouldn't help. Some parents accepted this, laughed at the funny, screaming kid photos, and moved on. Others did not take well to being told their turn was over by a teenage elf. I was never treated so poorly by people in my life. I was always polite and explained the reasons, and sometimes if my boss wasn't watching, I took extra photos. But sometimes I just couldn't. Once, a dad screamed and ranted at me so aggressively that mall security escorted me to my car when I left for the night. I had to call the police once because there was almost a riot over the policy that when Santa was leaving for his break or closing time, I had to shut down the line so he could exit exactly on schedule. Yes, there was a union for the Santas, and they had to have their breaks and leave the set at exact times stated in their contracts. They also had to have real big bellies, real beards, and real white hair. But none of this was the worst part of the job. The worst part was Santa Bill, the nice Santa who taught me what workplace sexual harassment is. One day before opening, while I was testing the camera, he kept insisting I sit with him and set the timer for a quick photo to check the camera. I thought it was weird since I didn't need to be in the photo, but I sat on the arm of his chair. Then he asked why I didn't sit on his lap like the kids. I said I hadn't been a kid for a long time and laughed it off. As I walked back to the camera stand, he grunted and said, My, you don't have an ounce of fat in the wrong place on your whole body. If that wasn't bad enough, I was responsible for escorting Santa Bill to and from the break room in the back of the mall, which had gray cement hallways behind the storefronts. I was working with another girl that day, and my boss wasn't coming in until the afternoon shift. Foolishly, I thought it could wait and that he wouldn't try anything. Well, on the walk, this gross, horny old man slapped me on the ass. Worried and realizing he was a predator, I kicked him in the gut and ran. I was old enough to know Santa wasn't real, but he ruined Santa for me forever that day. I called my sister's best friend, who told me Santa Bill had called her first, demanding I be fired or he would press charges. Thankfully, my boss knew I was not a troublemaker. After hearing my side, she told Santa Bill that if he called the police, she would happily show CCTV footage of him assaulting a minor and immediately fired him. She was bluffing, but it worked. The mean Santa covered the next day's full shift until the Santa Union sent a replacement. My boss also warned them there was a strong possibility Santa Bill was a predator and should not be around children. I don't know what happened to him, and I cannot look at a Santa without feeling sick, but that was definitely my worst job ever. Summary. My worst job was when I was sexually assaulted by Santa. Story 55. I worked for a company that filled vending machines for one day. The person assigned to train me said he had worked there for 20 years and sometimes worked 14 hours. We started at 5 a.m., and he said sometimes he would not get home until 8 p.m., then get up to work at 5 a.m. I told him that was not for me because I need a social life. I went in and told the manager that the job was not for me. I do not regret it at all. Story 56. Operating an industrial lathe boring steel billets in Texas in summer as a teenager. Hot as hell and the most boring job I have ever had. Story 57. Delivering pizzas for my college campus on a bicycle. The carts attached to the back do nothing to add stability and only add momentum, causing you to tip when taking a turn too fast. I think I still have a few scars from the crashes I had. Story 58. New attorney at a mid-level insurance defense firm. The pay was low, it was a revolving door for associates, the partners invested nothing in training new associates but were very demanding, the clients wanted nothing to do with you because they were getting sued, and it was a terrible cultural fit for me. I lasted a miserable year and a half before I landed an in-house position I still have, and that was almost 20 years ago. Story 59. I was a telemarketer selling an internet faxing service by cold calling people at their homes. I was a bad salesman, but I do not think Jordan Belfort could have sold random people internet faxing service from a cold call. It was a small company that I am pretty sure was engaging in some illegal business practices. Not a fun time. Story 60. I worked as a temporary employee when I was 19. I got a job in a lumber mill cleaning up sawdust. It does not sound that bad until you realize that it is under the mill where you cannot stand up, and all the sawdust is wet because they use water to cool the saw blades. You also have to use wheelbarrows and carts to remove the dust because there is a never-ending supply. I made it 2 days, and I am a glutton for punishment. Story 61. I worked in the office for a disreputable limousine company. There were several drivers who had recently been released from prison or rehab, some of whom relapsed on the job. One driver, when upset about not receiving enough of a tip, such as from children on their way to prom, told customers on several occasions that he wasn't afraid to go back to jail fighting over it. He later went to jail for murder. We sent a car full of high school children unchaperoned with a convicted murderer. We sent out beat-up and malfunctioning cars all the time. We ruined many summer weddings because the owner refused to pay to fix the air conditioning in the vehicles. At best, the exteriors were cleaned with a wet broom and dish soap, and the interiors were wiped down with an old, filthy chamois. If someone vomited or had sexual activity in the limousine just before your ride, a dirty chamois was the only barrier between you and the mess. This same chamois was often used by a particularly lazy detailer to wipe down the glassware, which is why most drivers bought their own. The owner was extremely cheap. He made drivers buy their own glassware, sodas, alcohol, decanters, and napkins. He refused to insure any of the limousines because he would often sell them, so why pay for insurance when he might sell the vehicle soon? Half the staff was paid in cash, often to avoid child support payments, and the owner was not shy about shortchanging them every payday because he knew they had no recourse. The owner was very racist. He asked several office workers to change their names when speaking on the phone because customers would trust employees more if they had American-sounding names. And that's just the information I feel comfortable sharing online. Story 62. Dollar Tree was all bad. Definitely could take advantage of it, though. From the terrible pay, the heavy drug users doing drugs in the bathroom, the rats, and basically feeling like I was working alone, often as an assistant manager. It was hell, to say the least. There was one day I was on the phone with emergency services, operating the register, and dealing with a vendor all at once. Story 63. This is going to sound privileged because it was a high-paying white-collar job at Amazon. I worked in a corporate function at a mid-high level, level 6, with zero support, unrealistic expectations, constant new demands, and meetings for 8 hours a day. Additionally, I worked on the East Coast while most of my team was on the West Coast, so they assumed I was always available to meet with our European teams. I worked Eastern Standard Time from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and was constantly told I should be producing more. While I was there, the stock value dropped by half. My salary was acceptable, but the job was the definition of a rat race. There was no praise or thanks, just, okay, that's done. Now do this, this, and this. Story 64. I was a waitress at a Mexican restaurant. Unfortunately, I did not know much Spanish, and what I did know was not very helpful. Only one cook spoke English, and his English was about as good as my Spanish. We tried to teach each other some to help. I had just turned 18, and my job was less about waitressing and more about entertaining in the back. Not sexually, but definitely dancing and teasing, and not waitressing. When it reached a point where I was no longer comfortable, I was fired. I never actually filled out an application or tax paperwork. I made only tips and whatever the cooks would occasionally give me at the end of the night. One of the cooks tried to get me to move in with him and his daughter, who was 2 years younger than me. Story 65. Working in the United States Federal Civil Service. It was astonishing how most people managed to reach adulthood without harming themselves due to their lack of judgment. Story 66. FedEx Courier. Management has no idea what they are doing and manages by intimidation. Story 67. I supervised high school-aged kids working at a fairly prestigious horse racing track. Initially, I thought the worst part of the job would be being adjacent to horse mistreatment, but it turns out the employees were treated just as poorly. Some highlights. They intentionally hired people with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities, because they knew they would tolerate a lot of bad treatment. They completely ignored rules about how many hours people under a certain age are allowed to work in our state. Several people were fired for legitimate reasons and then rehired the next day. Because everyone knew you basically could not get fired for anything short of violence, things descended into chaos quickly. An alarming number of the kids were drinking or smoking on the job. If caught, they were sent back to work in whatever state of inebriation they were in. One of the more senior supervisors was hiding that his wife, who also worked there in a customer-facing role, had advanced dementia. We would lose her most days. That barely scratches the surface. It was a terrible job, but at least I have stories. I quit about halfway through the season. Story 68. Credit card collections for a major bank. The stories you hear about why people have fallen behind just broke my heart. I was too nice for that job. My supervisor agreed and moved me to customer service. Story 69. I worked for one day at a factory that made fiberglass toolboxes for the backs of trucks. There was a mold that a robotic arm would spray with a cloud of fiberglass, resin, and hardener. Then the crew would step forward with rollers and smooth it down after they could see well enough through the cloud. The job required breathing in a cloud of fiberglass, resin, and hardener. It was poorly ventilated. People would regularly start a sentence, then trail off and stare. A random person would begin laughing hysterically, and we all had to wait until they regained control before continuing. One man went outside to vomit. On the first morning, after waking up with a massive hangover from inhaling chemicals all day, I called in and quit. Story 70. I lasted 3 weeks working on-site at a property management company. My first day of training involved answering the phone and taking messages from angry tenants. When I started having anxiety attacks driving to work in the 3rd week, I knew I was done. Story 71. As one of the managers of a wholesale club, it was the worst job ever. I lasted about 5 weeks. Between the long hours with no overtime pay and the minimum 35,000 steps a day, I literally felt like my body was begging me to quit after the 2nd week. It was exhausting and nowhere near as rewarding as people think it might be. I do not even list the job as a reference and merely say I did some traveling during that period. Story 72. Toss-up between stacking heavy boxes of fire logs and debt collector. I came very close to a suicide attempt while stacking the boxes, so I guess that. Story 73. My first job in the information technology industry was in the mid-1990s and was part of a crew cabling all of the dormitories for network access during the summer. This included married student housing, which were basically duplexes or quads, and attics in a hot summer. Sometimes it was over 130 degrees Fahrenheit up there. I also encountered long-dead, mummified mice and rats. It was not much fun. Story 74. I had a job at a game experience center. They put me on as a trial manager 2 weeks into the job, only showing me the 20 tasks I would have to do throughout the 14-hour shift. This included disabling alarms and organizing 2 staff members throughout the day while managing all the parties. A few months into the job, I got sick as my heart issues started to worsen again. I am only in my early 20s, so I do not like to risk anything health-wise. I needed a week in the hospital and a week at home. They had told me before that they understood from a personal perspective, but if I continued to get worse, they would have to fire me from a business perspective. However, I did not expect them to ignore the message I sent when I was admitted to the hospital on the morning of a shift. After that, I never heard from them again. Story 75. It's a tie between Walmart and the Advance Auto Distribution Center. At Walmart, the pay is terrible, both management and customers treat you poorly, and nobody was allowed any overtime. There was an instance where someone was told to avoid 30 seconds of overtime. At Advance, by the time I left, pay was okay but not good enough. They would work you to exhaustion, no matter how hot it was. Even if you were talking to someone about work, they would reprimand you. There was no air conditioning, even though it would reach up to 120 degrees inside during the summer. It was supposed to be 8-hour days, but most days lasted 10 to 12 hours. By the time you got off work, it felt like you had been through 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. Story 76. I was a customer service representative for a flexible spending account program. Sometimes companies would not put money into the account, and that is why people were not being reimbursed, but you were not allowed to tell them that. The program was highly disorganized. We never received their faxes in the early 2000s. Management did not care, and every caller was angry. I was yelled at on every single phone call. The worst was an elderly, devout lady who did her best to control her anger, but ended the call with, "God will have final judgment on you." I ended up walking out. Story 77. Product assembly for Lowe's and Walmart. Working conditions were outside and miserable. Pay was per item completed. It was backbreaking labor, and the pay was not very good either. It was with a company called National Assemblers. It was the worst job I have had to date. Story 78. It is hard to explain. English is not my first language. Sorry. I worked selling cell phones at different stores, directly for a company like AT&T. This company sent us to other stores to sell the company's cell phones and prepaid SIM cards. Customers had to make payments to activate the SIM card, and we had to tell them that if they did not make this payment, their warranty would not be valid. This was false. The warranty applied anyway, even if they did not buy the SIM card. The company was bad, but the stores were worse. They are very popular in my country, where phones are sold with something like store credit, paying in small amounts. However, the managers made us add overpriced insurance, and we were not supposed to tell customers or they would scold us. I liked my job because I learned about phones, but all these problems and the stress they put on us was disgusting. Story 79. I worked at Burger King for 2 weeks when I was 16. The manager trained me by having me watch several VHS tapes on how to prepare the food. Then she made me take apart the entire grill and clean it by myself. I think the grates weighed 50 pounds each, or at least it felt like it. I was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds. It's a toss-up between that job and the one where I worked for a wash, dry, full-service laundromat. I have pulled everything out of people's clothing and seen how they practice personal hygiene without gloves. Story 80. Loading chickens into the cages in a laying hen factory house. Nasty work for low pay. 25,000 chickens in 6 hours. Story 81. a certified nursing assistant in a county nursing home. Overworked, underpaid, dealing with blood, mucus, urine, feces, and sputum. Being punched, spit on, having feces thrown at me, slapped, pinched, and called every name in the book, all for less than $5 an hour in the 1980s. Story 82. Barista at a specialty coffee shop. Both of my grandparents died within the first month of me working there, and everyone acted very strange around me. Then I developed a chronic illness after COVID-19, which caused extreme fatigue. They would schedule me to work alone on busy days, knowing that stress worsens my symptoms. They scheduled me for morning shifts after I specifically asked not to, and they changed my schedule without informing me, which caused me to be late to work. They were clearly trying to get me to quit before firing me. Honestly, thank God they did. I am much happier now. I have never been more proud to say I was fired. Story 83. Cracker Barrel hostess lasted only 3 months. I was made to work while I had the flu in the middle of summer, and the building's air conditioning was out. I was very sick. I stood by the door to take names of waiting customers and kept running to the bathroom to vomit. I looked awful and could barely stand. I finally left and never returned. Story 84. Correctional officer. The job itself was easy. Respect the inmates and they usually respect you. Do your job, but remember they are humans and you are not RoboCop. It was the worst job because of my coworkers. Many of them were power hungry, and being a correctional officer fed that hunger. Treating inmates like dirt created dangerous situations for those correctional officers and everyone around them. I left after about a year. Story 85. Coffee stand. I actually like making coffee, but everyone who worked there was part of the same unusual evangelical church. Any job is difficult when you are inexplicably shunned by your coworkers. Story 86. One of the best jobs I ever had turned into the worst place I have ever worked. I am an information technology professional and joined an organization as a senior systems administrator. When I started, things were great. Management had its issues, but that is true everywhere. The issues were not insurmountable, just annoying. I worked with some absolutely amazing people, some of the best I have ever worked with, and would gladly work with them again. Then the chief information officer's decisions caught up with him, and he hastily resigned. The replacement was promoted from within, which I supported. I gave him my full support and tried to make the transition successful. Unfortunately, it turned out that he had no clue what he was doing and lacked courage. He trusted the wrong manager, and the place declined rapidly. Their way of managing was to sit at your cubicle and do nothing until told to. At one point, my supervisor and I were called into a conference room separately and questioned by the chief information officer, 2 managers, and the architect about our disaster recovery and continuity of operations plans and strategy. It is worth noting that I single-handedly re-architected the entire backup infrastructure to streamline it, improve recovery time objective and recovery point objective, and set it up to integrate easily into an off-site or cloud solution. The place became a toxic environment. Management violated the security policies we were mandated to follow and wrote us up whenever we refused to comply. It got so bad that we would do the work, but document it with a ticket and copy human resources and the union, noting that the work was done under protest and duress. I developed an alcohol dependency because of the situation, which I was able to overcome shortly after leaving. It has been a few years since I left, but I still wake up in a cold sweat from nightmares about the place. What I described barely scratches the surface. It took me over a year to recover from the trauma I suffered, and to this day, I have sensitivities to certain actions or statements by management that I have to actively manage. Thankfully, I am now in a much better place and very happy with where I am and the management team I have. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.